Thank you for joining us. Professor Sekou, can you give the audience just a brief background of like your job description, where you're from, and your passion for urban politics?
Sure. Well, as you know, I am an associate professor of political science over at the University of Hartford. I teach in Hillier College, which is one of the 7 colleges at the university. I also teach in arts and sciences as well. I teach a variety of different courses. I teach, for example, race and politics. I teach urban politics. I do American national government. I do campaign elections and voting behavior. So in terms of describing what I do in terms of my teaching, it really broadly is American politics with sort of an emphasis in those different areas. For me, my interest not only in urban politics, but my interest in, the kind of courses that I teach really comes out of, growing up in the city of Detroit and growing up in a major urban area that has undergone a rather dramatic transformation, over the years. It was transforming rapidly even when I was growing up in Detroit as a kid. And so, and it's changed a lot since I've left. And so for me, being interested in urban issues and being interested in, things like, jobs and the economy and, urban decline and, educational opportunity. I mean, all of those things were just a part of the world that I grew up in, and I had great mentors in the community who talked to me a lot about those kinds of issues, and it really nurtured my sort of desire to study politics and to understand urban areas and the kind of problems that people who live in urban communities face.
Very interesting. You also mentioned that you were growing up in Detroit watching the city revolutionize and change politically. In what ways would you say the city of Hartford has changed in the last 10 years or so?
Right. I mean, Hartford is just like many major urban, communities across America that have gone through different stages of, change and transformation or even decline. My hometown, the city of Detroit, is one that has really undergone a rather dramatic kind of decline, which may also suggest some of the challenges that Hartford may indeed face around the issue of bankruptcy. But, more specifically, the city of Detroit was a great manufacturing hub. The automobile industry was really big. In fact, Detroit, in the 1950s was thought of as the Paris of the West. I mean, it was just the birthplace of the middle class. It was a great city for people who were looking for jobs and opportunity and work. It was nearly 2 million people within the city, and now it's probably about 700,000. There's been an incredible decline, loss of jobs and industry within the city. And so when you look at a city like Hartford right now, which hasn't experienced the kind of devastation, that my hometown has experienced, but Hartford certainly has its challenges when it comes to jobs and economic opportunity, a decline of its manufacturing base, depopulation, loss of people from the city, especially people who are middle class taxpayers, from the city, white who have left the city, moved into the suburbs. Some of them have moved even further into the exurbs, which are beyond even the suburbs. Of course, what they take with them is population. They take tax dollars with them. And so, a city like Hartford in many ways sort of parallels some of the challenges that a city like Detroit has had. And right now, Hartford is probably facing one of its biggest challenges, which is this fairly large deficit that it's trying to, to deal with and trying to close, which will put a lot of pressures on the city in terms of services that it provides to citizens. And, closing that deficit will not be easy to do. Detroit declared municipal bankruptcy very recent, a few years ago. And, some are suggesting Hartford may have to look at, Detroit's experience as it tries to navigate, these very difficult financial times that the city faces.
Speaking of the city's deficit, I understand that the Connecticut state government is projecting a $170 million deficit. How do you feel like that will impact the city of Hartford, considering the fact that they're already in deficit of their own, just citywide? Now they're going to face even more pressure financially statewide.
I mean, I think it's important when you sort of think about Hartford to really understand the context in which Hartford operates in. Hartford is the capital city of the state of Connecticut. And as a capital city, what it essentially means is that there are a lot of government offices that are here in the city. Those government offices are off the tax rolls. Hartford is also a place where you have a lot of churches, for example, and schools and nonprofits within the city. And so Hartford has this sort of unique problem of being the capital city and a large number of its sort of taxable properties off the rolls and not able to tax. And so the city isn't able to sort of generate that kind of tax revenue. The state provides some compensation back for what's lost, but it really isn't enough given the amount that's off the books. Hartford also is home to a number of universities. I mean, the university that I work at and the university that you attend, there's a lot of talk right now about whether the University of Hartford should be paying taxes to the city of Hartford, along with Trinity and UConn Law School, because the city just needs that help in order to meet its expenses. There are a range of issues with regard to pension and labor contracts and money that's owed to workers within the city who have retired. And so there are a lot of real challenges that are very deeply rooted that have ramifications for not only Hartford and its residents, but also people who live around the city of Hartford. I mean, one of the things I often talk about in my urban politics class is that when you look at the city of Hartford, more people who live in the suburbs actually are the people who work in the city as opposed to people who live in the city having jobs within the city. And so Hartford is important not only to Hartford residents, but it's also important to the greater metropolitan area.
Interesting. So a lot of the city residents who still remain in Hartford, they work in Hartford, they live in Hartford, I understand have access to a lot of programs through Bushnell and different nonprofit organizations to get cultural experiences that they may not be able to afford on their own. How do you feel like the state and city deficit will impact these programs?
Right.
Because you mentioned that a lot of these programs and nonprofits are not taxable. So if they have to pay taxes, if everything is changed due to the deficit, how do you think that these programs will impact the citizens?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good question, and I think it really requires even stepping back a bit more to really sort of think about the importance of central cities as places, sites for culture, for example. And so when you think about a city like Hartford and the museums and, that are here within the city and the other sort of cultural attractions, the bars, the things like the Bushnell, things like Hartford Stage, Theater Works. I mean, I live outside of the city, but I come into the city to go to Hartford Stage, to go to Theater Works, and to go down to, Bushnell Park to hear jazz during the summer. And so, Hartford really serves as a sort of central place that people from around the region come to. But what that also means is that I often come into the city and enjoy all of these amenities, but I'm not really sort of paying the full price because I don't live in the city. I don't pay taxes and the tax dollars that help to create some of these, sort of cultural attractions. Hartford residents are shouldering that responsibility for doing that. And so I think, whenever you have a budget problem like the city has and the kinds of choices that perhaps need to be made about what, activities to cut, what programs to cut, ultimately those residents can in fact suffer as a result of that. And so I think as Hartford tries to figure out what it needs to do to sort of move forward and deal with the budget challenges that it faces, I think it needs to think very carefully about how it does that, because it impacts certainly city residents, but on the other hand, even for those of us who come from outside of the city into the city, there is the real possibility that we come into the city and we end up going to the restaurants, we end up spending money. At the end of the day, I'm purchasing tickets for a Hartford Stage, annual, sort of pass to see, their plays for the whole year. So I am spending money in the city, and you want to make sure you don't lose those opportunities to bring people into the city. Certainly the risk that's being taken now with the baseball stadium and some of the problems that have occurred as a result of that, really points to, on the one hand, the optimism of the previous mayor that this could be something that would pull people into the city and maybe help to revitalize the North End area around where the ballpark is at. build up the businesses in the downtown area. And these are things that a city like Hartford needs to do to get people coming into the city supporting businesses, because as we talk about the people who pay taxes, businesses are one of those folks who pay taxes, and so you want them to thrive, because if they're thriving, the city can thrive if it's able to generate tax revenue from that.
Yes, of course. In addition to this issue of the city deficit, I understand that the education system of Hartford has greatly been impacted by these financial issues.
Right.
In what way could the city of Hartford improve upon their education system as far as the charter schools that they have? Because I understand they have a host of charter and magnet schools, but it's hard to place city residents into these schools without making it hyper segregated.
Right. And so, Hartford has fairly complex educational challenges, right? And so, at one level, you have a situation where the city of Hartford, back in 1989, a group of parents decided to sue about, educational adequacy, and they sued on the basis of both racial isolation, but also socioeconomic isolation. They were able to win a court victory in the Sheff versus O'Neill case, which eventually led to, the implementation of a variety of different remedies to try to respond to the problem of racial and class isolation of students within the Hartford Public Schools and the educational inadequacy that those students were experiencing. One of the end results of that, of course, is that Hartford has created a large number of magnet schools around the city, with the attempt to both lure students from within the city to those magnets, but also to lure students from outside of the city into the magnets. And of course, Hartford has also been a place where folks have experimented with creating charter schools and providing optional choice for, parents to put their kids in charter schools under the sort of belief that this will also create, very unique and better educational opportunities. The challenge, of course, is that you're also draining students from the public schools and the neighborhood schools, and as a result of that, they've lost a lot of population, and you've got older buildings that have not sort of been maintained well over the years. You've got shrinking student population in some of those buildings, and now people are really pushing for some tough choices about which buildings to keep open, which to close. And as you know, there's been a list that has been generated of a few schools they'd like to close down, which has generated a lot of controversy. But at the end of the day, providing young people with the kind of educational opportunity that they need, providing one in which they're not racially and socioeconomically isolated is really what the ultimate goal is, but it really is a real challenge, for the city of Hartford to actually create those conditions on the ground. And, so people are really involved in fairly intense fights about, how to sort of chart a path that really creates that opportunity and does it in a way that the city can fiscally handle it. And at this point, that's a constant challenge for the city, being able to pay teachers, to pay for the kinds of services the students need in order to be able to succeed. And these budget challenges and the population challenges, make it difficult to do that. I mean, you were also sort of making the point about parents and the frustration some of them feel about particularly the magnet schools, which are, produced with the idea that they would be high quality sort of schools that would attract, parents from the suburbs, whites from the suburbs, as well as people of color to those schools. The problem, of course, is that in trying to provide that racial balance that you want to create within those schools, it may also mean that you have a situation where you set aside some seats for white parents from the suburbs, even though the demand from the central city is really high and parents want to get their kids into those schools. And so that has generated a lot of frustration for a lot of parents, understandably so, who want, great educational opportunities for their kids, but they can't get into those high quality magnet schools because of the desire to fulfill the requirements of the Sheff decision, which is that these schools also be racially and socioeconomically balanced. And sometimes that may mean that, students who want in are unable to get in and may find themselves in a lottery and be well down the list on that lottery, and that is frustrating.
Understandably so. There's been a lot of development with community organizations and outreach programs to kind of capture the youth and make sure that they're not participating in activity that wouldn't be good conduct, like the YMCA, Urban League of Greater Hartford, what other ways can community activists and residents get involved beyond the state level, beyond the city and political level?
I mean, there are always a wide range of activities that, you know, you can do to help young people. I mean, for me in particular, I sort of think about growing up in Detroit, and one of the things I thought really benefited me tremendously in terms of developing a work ethic and also helping me to become more disciplined in my approach to life was the fact that I had an opportunity to have a summer job. And what I mean by that is, you know, there were several, you know, programs, and, you know, CETA was one of the programs in Detroit that really hired young people and gave them jobs. And I won't say that I was like, you know, interning at some national corporation, but the idea of actually having a job and having work. And so when I think about, you know, the challenges that young people face, and particularly for Black and Latino youth in cities like the city of Hartford, you know, having access to employment opportunities is really a challenge. And so, you know, for me, if I, you know, had an opportunity to design what I thought was the sort of optimal kind of program to help young people sort of lay a foundation for future success, giving them the opportunity for paid work with decent wages and really getting, you know, really great job skills and learning the kind of discipline that might serve them, for example, if they, you know, decide to go to college. And, you know, there's just something about that. And I sort of look back at my life and my own sort of experiences, and that sort of opportunity to do that. It kept me out of trouble, kept me off the streets, gave me something to do, and also put a few dollars in my pocket that helped me with self-esteem and attitude. And so, you know, particularly for young people, 14, 15, 16 years of age, I think, you know, that can be a good thing. The other piece of that, of course, is that, you know, particularly for young people who don't decide to go to college, we've got to figure out how to create employment opportunities for them. And we've got to figure that out as a society. You know, I think there are lots of opportunities for students who don't go to colleges and universities in terms of the trades, for example, and gaining access to them. The pay is really good for some of these trades. They're good work, you know, good skills. Not everyone has to go to college. And if we can create those opportunities for people, I think that's a great thing. And then for the ones who do go to college, we've got to figure out how to make it more affordable, how to make it not be something that you come out with an incredibly difficult debt load, that it's practically impossible in many ways to actually pay off, you know, that debt load.
It is. I can't even like keep a straight face about that. If you had to advise the mayor on one subject area of politics, what program would you implement, and what would you like to see as a result from that program?
Right. And so certainly, as you can tell from a previous answer, you know, jobs and employment opportunities, I think, is really going to be key. I would couple that with education. I mean, I think, you know, there really needs to be a real focus on guaranteeing that young people have access to quality education, right? And so that's something that isn't just simply a government responsibility, but it's something that ultimately I think our communities are going to have to take charge of as well. And the involvement of people from within the community, it requires people like yourself, people like me, who have sort of moved into higher ed, you know, reaching back and spending time in the community and working with young people, giving them role models and examples that they can look to sort of give them something to aspire to. So if you're, you know, so if I'm, you know, talking to the mayor, you know, I'm asking this mayor and any mayor to really figure out how to tap, you know, these resources that these communities have in terms of the people who have, you know, leadership and have, you know, shown through example in terms of what they've done with their lives, and putting them in front of young people and getting them much more active, much more engaged, you know, with young people. I mean, there are many other things you can sort of reach for and do, but I think You know, that to me is just sort of important. I mean, I think about, you know, as you know, someone who grew up in a city like Detroit, you know, if you had asked me, what does it take to become a professor, I couldn't have told you, even in high school, what it took to become a professor. Someone asked me, what's a doctorate, I wouldn't have been able to talk about that. If you asked me, you know, what are the things, I knew about teachers, I knew about preachers, I knew about police officers, but not much more than that. And so we've got to put people in front of young people and let them know that, you know, this person is a physicist, this person studies communication, this person studies psychology, this person is going to law, this person is going into political science, this person is going into economics. To see that wide range of possibilities that you can have in front of you, and to help create that path for those possibilities to be realized by also creating the opportunities for them to do that. And so again, it's not, you know, a big sort of program as much as it's to say that we've got to do a much better job of helping people create a vision for themselves of success and what it will look like and how to translate that into reality. And I think for a lot of people, they really don't know how to do that just yet. And I was probably one of those kids, but I was fortunate that I had some good mentors who came into my life and sort of said to me, you know, you're not going to grow tall enough to play basketball, so you better think about something else to do with yourself.
Yeah, I'm not a hooper myself either. I did softball, but that didn't quite pan out the way I thought either.
Exactly.
But aside from that, the word mentorship keeps coming up in this conversation.
Right.
Do you feel like this generation is lacking that leadership within our role models and mentorship and that connection from the generation before us?
I think, you know, certainly, you know, there are more people out there that we can look to as role models, as people who are doing some really great things in the community and great things. I think, you know, there's a generation of young people who have come up in a nation in which their formative years have been developed with an African American in the White House, right? Yeah. But I think when we talk about role models, they need to be more direct. They need to be a lot closer. You know, it's sort of wonderful to think about what President Obama represents and what some of the other sort of celebrities and accomplished people represent. But what I'm really, you know, talking about are those people who are teachers, police officers, firefighters, you know, accountants, people who are much closer to earth and much closer to us and much more accessible to us, and that we need to have greater access to them, and we need to really step up to the plate and play a more direct role and create those examples that young people can look at and possibly emulate. And so I'm really big on the idea that, you know, I sort of think about some of the things that I do, you know, as a professor, and some of the things I do, and it's really good, you know, to have students, for example, who come back and really say, wow, you know, that was really a great program you put together, or that was really great what you said, and I'm going to really take that to heart. And so that, you know, we can have a very meaningful impact on people and a very meaningful impact on people in their lives, especially people who don't have sort of access to people who are doing those kinds of things. And I think it's just important to create more opportunities for that to occur. And so people are out there, you know, and I think there are more than there's ever been, but we've got to really sort of figure out how to bring people together and to really sort of build that kind of capital within, you know, these communities and build for the future.
Yes, of course. And it's so interesting because this is the age of technology and, you know, direct communication at seconds.
Right.
So it's interesting how we have less mentorship now, even though there's more direct access to somebody via email, text message, FaceTime, video communication, things like that. So where do you think that the breakdown occurred in this? Because my mother also mentions her mentor, and my father mentions his mentors. But I don't really, from my experience, remember too many mentors. Like, the most that I've met have been in my collegiate experience
Right.
rather than high school or elementary
Right.
school.
Yeah, and again, I mean, you know, this, when we sort of think about people who provide this kind of impact in our lives, this kind of positive impact, you know, where we may go wrong is sometimes we think of them as needing to be fairly extraordinary people who've done extraordinary things and just set this extraordinary example.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm a big believer in ordinary people who, in fact, can do extraordinary things. And so, you know, and that's why I say, you know, it's wonderful we have an African-American president, for example, for many African-American youth to look up and admire. But at the end of the day, you know, those are not the examples that I think we need to cling to. We need to cling to the fact that you had that one teacher who sort of pulled you aside, perhaps, and just gave you some advice about some choices to make, right? That sort of took you in one direction as opposed to another. I mean, you know, in my example, I had a, you know, fifth grade teacher who encouraged my mother to send me to a different junior high than the neighborhood one because he thought I had potential to maybe go on to college. And so that was a decision my mother told me about years later. But it was a teacher who really sort of saw something in me and wanted to encourage that and wanted to promote that. And so when I talk about mentors, I'm not really necessarily talking about people who, you know, even that you may sort of engage with on a regular basis, but there are people who really set good examples that you really look at and you take note of that, right? Even if you don't have a sort of personal relationship necessarily with them. And they always sort of recognize what they're doing and that people are in fact paying attention to them and they are setting, you know, good examples in terms of what they do and what they stand for and what they fight for, particularly within the community. And so when you look at a place like Hartford, I mean, there are many, you know, activists and organizers that are out there who are fighting, you know, to help the communities in which they live and to build, you know, a sense of community, to tackle some of the problems of police brutality and racism and discrimination that are out there. And what I'm saying is that people take note of that, right? You know, we often talk about, you know, many are called, few are chosen. I tend to believe many are called, a few answer. And that's really what the problem is that, you know, people are looking for someone to be chosen for this. And it's really about answering the call and really stepping up to the plate and, you know, putting yourself out there. And you'd be amazed how many people are paying attention to that and take note of that and will tell you later that, you know, you really did something that really impressed me. And it sort of helped me sort of understand the importance of doing that work and fighting that fight. And we can have that kind of impact. And I think it's important to sort of think of it in that way.
I love that quote, by the way. I think that accurately describes what's been going on. Thank you so much for joining us today. Guys, Professor Sekou, Dr. Bilal Sekou.
Thanks a lot.
Yes,
Thanks for having me. Sure thing. Thanks a lot.